The snow fell heavy that Christmas night in Greenwich, the kind that muffled sound and made the world feel smaller. Inside the Whitmore estate, 60 guests moved through rooms lit by crystal chandeliers, their laughter sharp against the clink of champagne flutes. The air smelled of roasted duck and old money, the kind that never questioned its own existence. Nyla Hartwell Whitmore stood near the dining room archway, one hand resting on the swell of her belly. 6 months pregnant. The burgundy dress she wore came from Macy's, not the designers Victoria preferred, and she knew her mother-in-law had noticed. Victoria noticed everything. The seating chart placed Nyla at the far end of the table near the kitchen door where staff moved in. Practiced silence. Grayson sat 17 feet away, flanked by board members and their wives. Serena Blackwood occupied the chair to his left, her laughter musical and calculated, her hand brushing his arm when she spoke. Nyla had stopped counting how many times. The guests settled into their seats as Victoria rose, her silk gown the color of winter roses. She lifted her glass and the room quieted with the reverence reserved for matriarchs who controlled trust funds and social invitations. "I want to share wonderful news," Victoria began, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd chaired 100 charity galas. "Grayson will soon welcome a son to carry forward the Whitmore legacy." Nyla's fingers tightened on her water glass. The baby kicked, a small flutter against her ribs. "I'm due in March," she said, her voice steady despite the 60 pairs of eyes that turned toward her. "We don't know if it's a boy or girl yet." Victoria's smile never wavered, but something cold moved behind her eyes. "I'm speaking of the child who will inherit the Whitmore name, dear. Bloodlines matter in families like ours." The words landed soft as snowfall and sharp as broken glass. A woman 3 seats down cleared her throat. Someone asked about the duck. Conversation resumed with the desperate energy of people pretending they hadn't witnessed cruelty in evening wear. Grayson studied his plate, knife and fork positioned at perfect angles. He'd learned that from Victoria, too. How to make silence look like discretion instead of cowardice. Nyla felt the baby move again, stronger this time. She pressed her palm against the place where a tiny foot pushed back and thought about her mother's journal, still sealed in the lawyer's office 8 years after Lorraine Hartwell had died. The envelope bore instructions written in her mother's careful script. "Open only when everything is taken." She hadn't understood what that meant then. The clarity came now, bitter and complete. Dessert arrived on silver platters, some French confection that cost more than Nyla's first year of college tuition. Victoria rose again, and this time she moved with purpose, heels clicking against marble as she approached Nyla's end of the table. The conversations dimmed. People sensed blood in the water. Victoria stopped beside Nyla's chair, close enough that her perfume, Chanel No. 5, the same scent she'd worn for 30 years, made the air feel thick. "This ring," Victoria said, reaching for Nyla's left hand before she could pull away. The sapphire caught the chandelier light, deep blue set in platinum filigree. "4 generations of Whitmore women have worn it. My grandmother received it in 1923. My mother wore it through the Depression. I wore it the day I married Richard." Her fingers closed around Nyla's hand, not gentle. "Did Grayson tell you its history when he gave it to you?" He had. Late night in their apartment when they still lived in Brooklyn and he still looked at her like she mattered. He'd explained how the sapphire came from Ceylon, how his great-grandfather had it set in New York, how the inscription inside read Constance Whitmore, 1923, in script so small you needed a jeweler's loupe to read it. He did. Victoria's grip tightened. "Then you understand what it represents, not just wealth, but lineage, heritage, things that can't be bought or borrowed or," her pause calculated perfectly, "acquired through circumstance." She pulled and the ring slid over Nyla's knuckle with the ease of something that had never quite fit. 60 witnesses sat frozen in their chairs, forks suspended, wine glasses paused halfway to mouths. This was the story they'd tell at brunches for months, the scandal that would season their gossip like salt. Victoria held the ring up to the light, examining it as if checking for damage. "This belongs to the Whitmore family," she said, voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Mixed blood doesn't earn the right to wear it." The baby kicked hard enough that Nyla gasped, a small involuntary sound that broke the terrible sunce. She pressed both hands to her stomach, protective instinct overwhelming the humiliation that burned through her chest. Grayson's chair scraped against marble. For one desperate second, Nyla thought he might stand, might finally choose her over his mother's approval. He reached for his wine glass instead. The Chateau Margaux Victoria had selected specifically for this evening, because she'd read somewhere that Grayson's newest client preferred French reds. "This is inappropriate," someone murmured. Emily Whitmore, Grayson's older sister who'd sat silent through 5 years of coded cruelty and was finding her conscience now, when it no longer mattered. Victoria turned, and her smile could have frozen the Hudson. "What's inappropriate, Emily, is pretending certain realities don't exist. The Whitmore name means something in this city. It has meant something for 140 years. I won't watch it diluted by—" She gestured at Nyla, a wave of her hand. That encompassed everything she couldn't say in polite company. The unspoken words hung thick, by poverty, by difference, by the presumption of a black woman who dared to marry above her station. Serena Blackwood leaned close to Grayson, whispering something that made him nod. Her hand rested on his forearm, casual possession in plain sight. Nyla stood, the movement awkward with her belly's weight. Her chair caught on the rug and she had to steady herself against the table. 60 guests watched her struggle for balance the way people watch accidents unfold, horrified and transfixed and grateful it wasn't happening to them. "I need air." The words came out smaller than she meant them. Victoria blocked her path close enough that Nyla could see the fine lines around her mouth that no amount of Botox could erase. "You need to remember your place." Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper meant only for Nyla. "You came from nothing, a coffee shop in Brooklyn serving lattes to people who matter. You thought you could marry into significance, but breeding shows. It always shows." She raised her voice again, performing for the audience that pretended not to listen. "I think it's best if you leave. The guests came to celebrate Whitmore's success, not watch you pretend you belong at this table." Nyla's heart hammered against her ribs. The baby turned restless in the womb, as if sensing her mother's distress. She thought about the cottage in Connecticut where she'd grown up. Her father's hands black with soil from tending gardens while her mother worked 2 jobs to keep them fed. She thought about Columbia Business School, the scholarship that covered tuition but not dignity, the classmates who'd never had to choose between textbooks and groceries. She thought about Grayson 7 years ago, sitting in that Brooklyn coffee shop with his Brooks Brothers suit and genuine smile, how he'd left notes in her coat pocket written on napkins. "You make the best cappuccino in 5 boroughs. Dinner?" How he'd met her father and shaken Isaiah's hand with respect, calling him Mr. Hartwell without condescension. That man didn't exist anymore. Maybe he never had. Victoria gripped her arm, fingers digging through the thin fabric of her dress. "I said leave." "Mom," Grayson's voice finally. Quiet and useless. "Your mother's right." Serena speaking up for the first time all evening, her words honeyed with false concern. "Stress isn't good for the baby. Nyla should rest." The implication clear. This baby, this pregnancy was Nyla's burden alone. The Whitmore heir would come from better stock. Victoria pulled harder and Nyla stumbled. Someone gasped. A wine glass tipped, red spreading across white linen like blood. "Get out of my house!" The words came soft, almost gentle, which made them more vicious. Victoria released Nyla's arm and picked up her wine glass, a crystal flute that probably cost more than Nyla's entire wardrobe. Then she poured. The Bordeaux hit Nyla's hair first, cold and shocking, then ran down her face in rivulets. It soaked into her dress, stained her skin, dripped onto the floor in dark drops that matched the sapphire Victoria still clutched in her other hand. 60 people sat paralyzed. Not one of them moved. Nyla stood there, wine dripping from her chin, her dress ruined, her dignity stripped away in front of people whose approval had once mattered to her husband. The baby kicked again, harder, and she realized she was crying. No sound, just tears mixing with wine on her cheeks. "This child," Victoria's voice cut through the shocked silence. "This mixed-blood baby you're carrying, it will never be a Whitmore. I don't care what DNA says, it will never inherit, never belong, never be anything but a reminder that my son made a mistake." She dropped the sapphire ring into Nyla's glass, where it sank through melted ice with a small splash. 7 years I've watched you play house with my son. It's over now. Serena understands what's required of a Whitmore wife. Grace, breeding, the ability to move in circles that matter. Nyla's hands shook as she wiped wine from her eyes. The dress clung to her, wet and cold against her skin. She looked at Grayson one last time, hoping for something. An objection, a defense, even just eye contact. He stared at his plate. "Get her out," Victoria said to no one in particular. "I won't have her making a scene at my Christmas dinner." 2 servers materialized, young men in white jackets who'd been trained to handle difficult situations with discretion. They moved toward Nyla with apologetic faces, and she realized they were going to touch her, escort her out like drunk guests got escorted out of weddings. She held up one hand. "Don't!" Her voice came stronger now, steadied by something beyond humiliation. She was 6 months pregnant, soaked in expensive wine, abandoned by her husband in a room full of witnesses who would never speak up because speaking up cost social capital they weren't willing to spend. But she could still walk out on her own terms. Nyla moved toward the foyer, each step deliberate despite the way her legs trembled. Behind her, conversation began again, tentative at first, then building to its previous volume. They'd absorbed the scandal and moved on to tiramisu. The marble floor felt cold through her shoes. Someone had opened the front door, helpful or cruel, she couldn't tell, and December wind cut through her wet dress with vicious efficiency. Her coat hung in the hall closet, a simple black wool she'd bought on sale at Nordstrom Rack. Victoria stood between her and the closet, arms crossed, expression carved from ice. "The coat stays. Everything in this house stays. You leave with what you're wearing and nothing else." Nyla's suitcase sat by the stairs, packed that morning when she'd still believed in reconciliation. She'd folded tiny onesies and blanket sleepers, imagining a nursery where Grayson read bedtime stories and Victoria softened at the sight of her grandchild. Foolish. The word tasted bitter as the wine still clinging to her lips. She walked past her suitcase, past the coat closet, past the life she'd tried to build in this house that had never been hers. The cold hit like a fist when she stepped outside, and she gasped, her breath fogging in air that felt like knives. Snow fell heavier now, already covering the driveway in white. Her shoes, burgundy heels bought to match the dress, sank into 2 inches of powder. The cold seeped through thin soles, numbing her feet with each step. Behind her, the door closed. No slam, just a quiet click that said she didn't matter enough for drama. Nyla made it to the edge of the circular driveway before her legs gave out. She knelt in the snow, one hand braced against frozen concrete, the other cradling her belly. The baby moved, and she whispered to it even though her teeth chattered too hard to form coherent words. "This is what 6 months pregnant and homeless looks like," she thought. "This is how far you can fall when you trust the wrong people." Headlights swept across the driveway and she looked up expecting, what? Grayson finally coming to his senses? Emily with a coat and an apology? A FedEx truck idled at the gate, its driver leaning out the window to punch the call buck. When no one answered, he started to reverse, then stopped. His headlights caught Nyla kneeling in the snow, wet dress frozen to her skin, barefoot now because she'd lost one shoe somewhere between the house and here. The truck door opened. Boots crunched through snow. "Ma'am?" The voice came gentle, like he was approaching a wounded animal. "Are you okay?" Nyla tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The cold had moved past discomfort into something dangerous, the kind that made thinking slow and movements clumsy. The driver, young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a name tag that read Elijah, pulled off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The fleece-lined canvas felt like heaven. "What happened?" He scanned the mansion, its windows golden with warmth, the party visible inside like a tableau of people who'd never known cold. "Someone hurt you?" The concern in his voice broke something loose in Nyla's chest. She shook her head, not trusting herself to speak without sobbing. Elijah crouched beside her, careful not to crowd. "Can I call someone? Police? Ambulance?" "My father." The words came through chattering teeth. "I need my father." He helped her stand, his grip firm but respectful, and guided her toward the truck. The cab smelled like diesel and pine air freshener, and the heater blasted warm air that made her skin prickle as feeling returned. "What's the number?" Nyla recited it from memory, the Connecticut area code she'd called 1,000 times growing up. Elijah dialed on his cell phone, then handed it to her. Isaiah Hartwell answered on the second ring, his voice rough with the kind of sleep that comes at 10 p.m. when you wake at 5 for gardening work. "Hello? Dad." The word cracked in her throat. "I have my answer." Silence on the other end, the kind that held too much weight to rush. Then Isaiah's voice came through, steady as bedrock. "Where are you, sweetheart?" "Outside the house, they—" She couldn't finish. Couldn't find words for what had happened that wouldn't make her sound weak and stupid for enduring it this long. "I'm coming. Stay warm. I'll be there in 40 minutes. The line went dead before she could protest. 40 minutes from Connecticut to Greenwich meant he was already moving, already grabbing keys and coat, already becoming the father who'd promised to protect her when her mother died, and he'd been left alone to raise a daughter in a world that judged her by skin and circumstance. Nyla handed the phone back to Elijah, who'd turned the heat higher despite the sweat beading on his own forehead. "Thank you," she managed. "You didn't have to stop." His expression said everything words couldn't. That of course he stopped. That anyone would stop. That basic human decency wasn't something to thank people for. But Nyla had watched 60 people sit silent while Victoria destroyed her, so she knew better. The mansion's front door opened, spilling light and laughter across the snow. Victoria stood silhouetted in the doorway, her posture regal even from this distance. She raised her voice, projecting like an actress on stage. "Your imaginary rich father coming to save you? How tragic that you have to invent rescue fantasies." Laughter from inside, cruel and carrying. Elijah's jaw tightened. "You want me to say something to her?" Nyla shook her head. Words couldn't touch Victoria, not when she'd insulated herself with money and social standing and the unshakable belief that some people simply mattered more than others. But actions could. Nyla settled deeper into Elijah's jacket and looked at her phone's clock. 15 minutes had passed since she called her father. 25 more, and Victoria Whitmore would understand exactly how badly she'd miscalculated. The snow fell heavier, covering the driveway in fresh white that erased her footprints one flake at a time. Inside the truck cab, Elijah kept the engine running and the heat high, offering silence instead of questions because he seemed to understand that sometimes kindness meant just being present. Nyla closed her eyes and felt the baby shift, restless but safe. She pressed her palm to the place where a tiny foot kicked and thought about her mother's journal, sealed all these years with instructions she'd never understood until tonight. Everything had been taken. The home, the marriage, the dignity, the belief that love could overcome difference if you just tried hard enough and made yourself small enough and never asked for too much. Now she could open the envelope and read what her mother had left behind. Whatever wisdom Lorraine Hartwell had sealed away for exactly this moment. But first, she'd wait. 23 minutes until her father arrived. 23 minutes until Victoria learned that some people don't have to imagine rescue. They just know who to call when the world turns cold. Rewind 7 years. Brooklyn in summer when the city smelled like hot garbage and possibility. Nyla Hartwell worked the morning shift at Common Grounds, a coffee shop in Park Slope where writers pretended to work on novels and mothers escaped toddlers for 90-minute increments. She made cappuccinos with the kind of precision that came from doing something enough times that your hands knew the motions before your brain caught up. 2 years of Columbia Business School under her belt, 1 more to go, and a scholarship that covered tuition but nothing else. Coffee shop wages paid rent on a studio apartment she shared with 2 roommates and a radiator that clanged like it was angry at being alive. Grayson Whitmore walked in that July morning wearing a suit that fit too well to be anything but custom. He ordered an Americano, black, no sugar, and left a 20 on a $4 bill because his wallet apparently didn't contain smaller denominations. "Keep the change." The words carried the easy generosity of someone who'd never had to count coins. Nyla made his coffee and didn't think about him again until he came back the next day. Same suit, different tie, same order. This time he sat in the corner with architectural magazines spread across the table, making notes in margins like the pages belonged to him. Third day, he left a napkin tucked under his cup with words written in careful print. "Best coffee in Brooklyn. What time do you finish your shift?" "Fourth day," she wrote back. 2 p.m. "Why?" "Fifth day. Because I'd like to buy you lunch, somewhere nicer than this. No offense to your excellent establishment." She said yes because he had kind eyes and because she'd learned to recognize the difference between men who wanted something from you and men who wanted to know you. Grayson seemed like the latter, though time would prove her wrong about which category he actually occupied. They had lunch at a Thai place in Cobble Hill where the pad Thai came on chipped plates and cost $8. He asked about her degree, her goals, what she wanted to build with her MBA. Not who her family was or where she came from, just who she intended to become. He told her he worked in real estate development, specializing in sustainable building retrofits. He'd grown up in Greenwich, yes, with money, yes, but he wanted to do something that mattered beyond adding zeros to his mother's investment portfolio. Nyla believed him. 6 months of dating that felt like discovering a language she'd been waiting her whole life to speak. Grayson brought her books he thought she'd like, Toni Morrison and Octavia Butler and Zadie Smith. He remembered her coffee order even when they met at different places. He held her hand on the subway and didn't let go when his friends from prep school walked past. He met Isaiah on a November afternoon that smelled like wood smoke and dying leaves. The cottage in Connecticut looked small against the forest that surrounded it, its paint peeling and porch sagging, the kind of humble that made people with money uncomfortable. Isaiah wore work clothes, denim worn soft with age, flannel shirt patched at the elbows, boots caked in mud from the garden he tended for wealthy families who never learned his last name. Grayson shook his hand. "Mr. Hartwell, thank you for letting me visit." Isaiah studied him the way gardeners study soil, checking for composition and truth. "Nyla says you're serious about her." "I am, sir. Serious enough to meet a father who works with his hands instead of sitting in boardrooms?" Grayson didn't flinch. Serious enough to hope I earn your approval, regardless of what work you do or I do. What matters is whether I'm good enough for your daughter." Isaiah had smiled then, rare and genuine. "Smart answer. Sit down. Let's see if you mean it." They'd spent 3 hours on that porch talking about everything and nothing. Baseball and architecture and how the rich threw away perfectly good plants instead of learning to prune them back to health. Grayson helped Isaiah transplant tomato seedlings, getting dirt under his manicured nails without complaint. When they left, Isaiah had pulled Nyla aside. "He's got good bones," he'd said, using the language of carpentry he'd learned from his own father. "But good bones don't mean much if the foundation's weak. Watch how he acts when his people meet you. That'll tell you what he's really made of." Nyla had dismissed the warning as fatherly overcaution. Isaiah didn't understand that Grayson was different, that he'd chosen her precisely because he didn't care about the things his mother valued. The engagement came in spring, a simple proposal in Prospect Park where they'd had their first real conversation. No flash mob, no photographer, just Grayson on one knee with the Whitmore sapphire ring he'd inherited from his grandmother. "Marry me," he'd said. "Build something real with me. Something that matters more than money or names or what anyone else thinks we should be." She'd said yes because she believed him. The wedding followed in summer, small ceremony, courthouse vows, reception at a restaurant in Fort Greene that served good wine and better food. Victoria attended because absence would have caused gossip, but her disapproval radiated like heat off asphalt. "You're making a mistake," she told Grayson in a voice just loud enough for Nyla to overhear. "This girl, she's after what you represent. Girls like her always are." Grayson had defended her then, told his mother that Nyla was brilliant and kind and everything he wanted, that love mattered more than pedigree. Victoria had smiled her ice smile. "We'll see how long that sentiment lasts. 2 years of happiness, if happiness meant the kind of contentment that comes from not examining too closely what holds it together." They moved from Brooklyn to a brownstone near Gramercy Park, Grayson's choice. Paid with bonuses he said came from successful projects. Nyla graduated with her MBA and took a position at a nonprofit focused on affordable housing development, work that paid poorly but felt right. Grayson got promoted to CEO of Whitmore Industries, a mid-sized firm that specialized in corporate real estate. The promotion came with a salary increase that meant Nyla could have quit her job, but she didn't. Money felt like quicksand. The more you had, the harder it became to remember what solid ground felt like. Year 3, the erosion began, small at first. Victoria's comments at family dinners delivered with surgical precision where others couldn't hear. "That dress is very colorful, Nyla. I suppose different cultures have different aesthetics." Or, "Grayson, darling, did you see that Jennifer's daughter is back from Paris? Such an accomplished girl, speaks 4 languages. The implication clear, unlike your wife, who only speaks 1 and grew up poor. Grayson stopped defending her, started arriving late to dinners, staying late at the office, coming home with the kind of tired that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with a choice being made slowly, one small compromise at a time. Year 4 brought Serena Blackwood into their lives, hired as VP of Marketing, daughter of a state senator. Exactly the kind of woman Victoria would have chosen for her son. Polished and connected and white in ways that mattered to people who pretended they didn't notice such things. Nyla watched Serena's hand linger on Grayson's arm at company events. Watched her whisper things that made him smile. Watched the way Victoria lit up when Serena entered a room. The approval she'd never shown Nyla radiating like sunlight. "She's very talented," Grayson said when Nyla mentioned it. "Good at her job. That's all? What else would there be?" He'd started sleeping in the guest room, claiming his snoring kept her awake. Started traveling more for business. Started looking through her instead of at her, the way people look through service staff. Present, but not quite real. Year 5, Month 1. Nyla discovered she was pregnant. She'd taken 3 tests to be sure, hands shaking as she watched pink lines appear like promises. She told Grayson over dinner at the restaurant where they'd had their wedding reception, hoping the location would remind him of who they'd been. "I'm pregnant." He'd frozen, fork halfway to his mouth. Then he'd set it down carefully, aligning it with his knife like Victoria had taught him, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Are you sure?" 3 tests, sure. Silence that stretched too long. Finally, "Okay, we'll figure it out." Not joy, not excitement, not even warmth. Just calculation behind eyes that used to look at her like she mattered. Month 4, the affair became obvious. Texts on his phone he didn't bother hiding anymore. Late nights that smelled like perfume that wasn't Nyla's. The way he flinched when she tried to hold his hand. She'd confronted him once, her belly just starting to swell with their child. "Are you sleeping with Serena?" He'd looked genuinely confused, like the question didn't make sense. "Does it matter?" "Does it? Grayson, I'm carrying your baby. My mother thinks—" He'd stopped, realizing what he was about to say. "Your mother thinks what?" "Nothing. Forget it." But Nyla had understood perfectly. Victoria thought the baby wasn't really Whitmore, wouldn't really count, would dilute the bloodline she'd spent her life protecting. And Grayson, who'd once promised love mattered more than pedigree, had started to agree. Month 6 brought Christmas and the dinner where everything ended. Nyla had dressed carefully, hoping her burgundy dress would signal she was trying, that she wanted to belong, that she'd make herself small enough to fit the space they'd decided she could occupy. Instead, she'd been removed from the space entirely. Now she sat in Elijah's FedEx truck, waiting for her father, and understood that the erosion hadn't been gradual at all. It had been systematic, planned, executed with the kind of precision that required coordination. Victoria hadn't just tolerated Serena. She'd introduced her, cultivated her, positioned her as the acceptable replacement for the mistake her son had made in marrying poor and black. And Grayson had let it happen because somewhere between the Brooklyn coffee shop and the Greenwich mansion, he'd decided his mother was right. Breeding showed. It always showed. The truck's headlights caught movement at the gate. Not Isaiah yet. Too soon. Instead, Emily Whitmore picked her way through snow in heels meant for marble floors, her coat clutched tight against the cold. Elijah rolled down the window as she approached. "Is Nyla—" Emily's voice cracked. "Can I talk to her?" Nyla stared at her sister-in-law through fogged glass. Emily, who'd sat silent. Emily, who'd whispered that things were inappropriate only after Victoria had already destroyed everything that mattered. "Now you want to talk?" Emily's face crumpled. "I'm sorry, I should have. I was afraid of Mom. I know that's not an excuse. I know I failed you." "You all failed me," Nyla said quietly. 60 people in that room, not one of you stood up." "I know." Tears froze on Emily's cheeks. "I brought your coat and your suitcase. It's not enough. I know it's not enough, but I—" She held out the black wool coat like an offering. Nyla took it because she was cold, not because it absolved anything. "Thank you." Emily set the suitcase in the snow. "If you need anything for the baby, I want to help. You want to ease your conscience." "Yes," Emily admitted. "But also, that baby is my niece or nephew. Whitmore or not, family or not. I want them to know they have an aunt who's sorry she didn't fight harder." Nyla pulled on the coat and warmth flooded through her with dizzying relief. "I'll remember you said that." Emily nodded and retreated toward the house, her footprints dark against the snow. Elijah checked the side mirror. "Someone's coming. Big car." Not a car, 8 of them. Rolls-Royce Phantoms in glossy black, moving in formation like a funeral procession. They turned through the gate one by one, their headlights sweeping across the mansion in harsh white beams. The lead car stopped beside the FedEx truck. The rear door opened and Isaiah Hartwell stepped out wearing the same work clothes he'd worn that November afternoon when Grayson had met him for the first time. Denim worn soft with age, flannel shirt patched at elbows, boots caked in mud. But the men who emerged from the other 7 cars wore suits that cost more than Elijah's truck, carried themselves with the quiet authority of people who controlled boardrooms and congressional hearings, moved with the precision of an operation planned long before tonight. Isaiah looked at Nyla through the truck's window, and she saw something in his face that transcended love or protection. She saw patience that had waited years for exactly this moment, strategy disguised as simplicity, the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself because everyone who mattered already knew. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, gentle as always. "I think it's time we had a conversation with the Whitmores about who owns what in this city." He held out his hand, and Nyla took it, stepping down from the truck into snow that didn't feel so cold anymore. Behind them, the mansion's front door opened. Victoria stood there, flanked by Grayson and Serena, all 3 wearing expressions that shifted from superiority to confusion to something approaching fear as they registered the convoy of cars, the men in expensive suits, and Isaiah Hartwell standing at the center of it all, like he'd been there the whole time, just waiting for his cue. "Mr. Hartwell," Victoria called out, her voice carrying false cheer. "What an unexpected visit. Though I'm afraid this is a private event." "Is it?" Isaiah's voice carried despite not rising above conversational volume. "Because from where I'm standing, you just assaulted my pregnant daughter at what you called a Christmas celebration. That seems pretty public to me." He turned to the men behind him. "Sterling, would you say throwing wine on a pregnant woman constitutes assault?" An older man in a charcoal suit stepped forward. "In Connecticut, yes, sir. Assault in the 3rd degree. Also potential grounds for a hate crime enhancement, given the racial language used." Victoria's face went white. "I don't know what Nyla told you, but—" "She didn't have to tell me anything," Isaiah interrupted. 60 witnesses. You think in a crowd that size nobody's going to talk? I had 4 different accounts of what happened before I left Connecticut." Grayson found his voice. "Who are you? I mean, who are you really? Nyla said you were a gardener." "I am a gardener," Isaiah said mildly. "Been tending to gardens for 46 years. Started when I came to this country from Jamaica with $200 and a strong back. Learned that rich people pay good money to have someone else dig in dirt while they sit inside and pretend they're better than the soil." He smiled, and it held no warmth. "But I also learned that rich people throw away good things because they don't understand value. So I started keeping what they discarded, invested it, grew it, turned $200 into something considerably more substantial." One of the suited men handed Isaiah a folder. He opened it, casual as checking a grocery list. "Whitmore Industries," he read. "Incorporated 1998. Current valuation approximately $400 million. Specializes in commercial real estate development and corporate property management. CEO Grayson Whitmore, appointed 2019 following a convenient board restructuring." He looked up at Grayson. "You remember that restructuring, son? When the previous CEO retired unexpectedly and you got promoted despite having less experience than 3 other candidates?" Grayson's jaw worked. "I earned that position." "Did you?" Isaiah's smile widened. "Or did someone arrange it? Someone who owned enough shares to control board votes? Someone who wanted to see what kind of man his daughter had married?" The silence that followed felt like falling. "No," Grayson whispered. "That's impossible." Isaiah handed him the folder. "Page 3. Ownership structure of Whitmore Industries. You'll find it interesting reading." Grayson's hands shook as he flipped pages. His face went from white to gray to the color of old snow. "Griffin Global Holdings owns 87% of our stock," he read aloud, voice hollow. "Acquisition date June 2018, 2 months after you married my daughter. I bought your company as a wedding present. Isaiah confirmed. Wanted to see if you'd love her when you thought you'd built something yourself. Wanted to see if you'd stay humble when success came easy. Wanted to know if you were the man you pretended to be in that Brooklyn coffee shop. He looked at Victoria, and his expression turned to ice. You failed spectacularly. The boardroom at Whitmore Industries occupied the 47th floor of a Manhattan tower that scraped clouds on clear days. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city in steel and glass, a view that cost extra in lease agreements and reminded everyone who sat at the table exactly how high they'd climbed. Isaiah Hartwell walked into that boardroom at 8:15 on a December morning, still wearing his work clothes, mud-crusted on boots that left prints across carpet worth more per square foot than most people earned in a week. Behind him came 15 lawyers in suits cut with the precision of surgical instruments, carrying briefcases made from leather that had never seen the inside of a department store. Grayson stood at the head of the table where he'd presided over quarterly reports and merger negotiations, his face the color of someone who'd just watched their entire reality dissolve. Victoria sat 3 chairs down, spine rigid, hands folded in her lap like she could hold herself together through sheer force of will. Serena Blackwood occupied the chair that should have belonged to the CFO, her expensive manicure drumming against mahogany in a rhythm that betrayed calculation happening behind perfectly composed features. 12 board members filled the remaining seats, men and women who controlled investment portfolios and political connections, who'd built careers on knowing which way power flowed and positioning themselves accordingly. They'd arrived expecting discussion of a $4.2 billion merger with Griffin Global Holdings, the kind of deal that made Wall Street Journal headlines and secured legacies. Instead, they got Isaiah Hartwell looking like he'd walked off a landscaping crew, and the cognitive dissonance showed on every face. Sterling Hayes, the lead attorney who'd greeted Isaiah with deference that turned Grayson's stomach, placed a leather portfolio at the head of the table and opened it with movements that suggested ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, I present Isaiah Hartwell, founder and sole proprietor of Griffin Global Holdings. Mr. Hartwell currently controls assets valued at $3.2 trillion across 847 subsidiary companies in 43 countries. His personal net worth exceeds the GDP of 162 nations. The words fell into silence so complete that the heating system's hum became audible. One of the board members, Richard Chen, old money from San Francisco who'd once told Nyla at a company dinner that affirmative action had lowered standards everywhere, cleared his throat. This is some kind of joke. Griffin Global is owned by a consortium of international investors. There's no public face because I prefer privacy, Isaiah finished. Built my first million buying rare earth minerals when everyone else thought they were worthless. Built my first billion shorting mortgage-backed securities in 2007, while people like you were still calling them safe investments. Built my empire staying invisible while men who thought they were smarter broadcast their every move. He pulled out the chair at the table's head, Grayson's chair, and sat. Now I'm visible, because my daughter was assaulted in front of 60 witnesses, and the people responsible need to understand exactly who they're dealing with. Victoria found her voice, though it emerged thinner than usual. If you're who you claim to be, why did you let Nyla work in a coffee shop? Why let her live in poverty if you could have given her everything? I gave her something better than everything. I gave her the chance to know who loved her for herself instead of my bank account. I gave her 5 years to find out if Grayson Whitmore was the man he pretended to be. Isaiah's gaze fixed on Grayson with the weight of judgment years in the making. He wasn't. Grayson gripped the table edge, knuckles white against dark wood. You manipulated my entire career. Everything I built, you built nothing. Isaiah's voice carried the kind of patience reserved for explaining obvious truths to slow learners. Every promotion came because I arranged it. Every successful deal happened because I instructed my subsidiaries to hire Whitmore Industries. Every bonus in your account originated from Griffin Global funds rerouted through accounting structures designed to make you believe in your own competence. Sterling slid a document across the table. Grayson picked it up with hands that trembled visibly. Page 12, Sterling noted. Details of your appointment to CEO. The previous CEO, Marcus Bennett, received a $20 million severance package to retire early, despite excellent performance reviews. Griffin Global funded that severance specifically to create the vacancy you filled. The paper crinkled in Grayson's grip. Why? I told you. I wanted to test you. See if success would reveal character or destroy it. Isaiah stood and walked to the windows, hands clasped behind his back like a general surveying terrain. You met my daughter when she was nobody in your world, a scholarship student serving coffee to people who'd inherited their opportunities. And you saw her anyway, wrote her notes, asked about her dreams, treated her father with respect even though I wore work clothes and spoke with an accent your mother probably mocked at country club lunches. He turned, and something in his expression made the temperature feel like it dropped. I thought maybe you were different. Maybe you'd stay different even when life got comfortable. So I bought your company and made you comfortable. Gave you the promotion, the salary, the illusion of being self-made. Watched to see if you'd remember the woman who loved you when you had nothing to offer but yourself. The silence stretched until Victoria broke it, her voice sharp with the desperation of someone watching her social standing crumble in real time. This is extortion. You can't manipulate people's lives like chess pieces, can't I? Isaiah smiled without warmth. I've been doing exactly that for 46 years. The difference is I'm honest about it now. He returned to his chair and opened another folder, this one thick with printouts and highlighted sections. Whitmore Industries. Current market valuation $400 million. Outstanding debt $210 million. Most of it secured against properties you don't actually own because they're held in trusts created by Griffin Global. Annual revenue $93 million, 70% of which comes from contracts with companies I control. Employee count 642, including your wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, who you've systematically excluded from company events for the past 18 months. Each word landed like a hammer blow. Grayson sank into the nearest chair, no longer trying to maintain the CEO posture Victoria had drilled into him since childhood. Without Griffin Global support, Whitmore Industries becomes insolvent within 90 days. Your stock price, currently at $42 per share, will hit zero before lunch today when I announce withdrawal from the merger. You'll lose money too, one of the board members ventured. Martin Krause, hedge fund manager who'd made his fortune betting against American manufacturing. Griffin Global has already invested significant capital in due diligence. I can afford to burn $4 billion teaching lessons about respecting my daughter. Can you afford to be collateral damage when I do? The question hung unanswered because everyone in the room understood that Isaiah Hartwell meant every word. People didn't accumulate $3 trillion by bluffing. The door opened and Nyla entered, her presence shifting the entire energy like someone had opened a window in a room that had been suffocating. She wore a white suit that somehow made her pregnancy look powerful instead of vulnerable. Her hair pulled back to reveal features that hadn't needed Victoria's wine to show their beauty. The 12 board members stood reflexively, some from genuine respect, others from the animal instinct to recognize when power dynamics had inverted. Grayson and Victoria remained seated, paralyzed by the impossibility of the woman they'd dismissed walking in like she owned the building, which, Nyla realized as the thought crystallized, she technically did, or would once inheritance structures resolved. She met her father's eyes and saw pride there, but also something else. A question. Are you ready? Nyla placed both hands on her belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly inside. For this child's sake, she'd survived worse than a boardroom confrontation. She could survive speaking truth to people who'd spent years convincing themselves their cruelty was justified. "Good morning," her voice carried despite not rising above conversational volume. "I appreciate you all making time for this meeting, though I suspect most of you would have found excuses to be anywhere else if you'd known what it was actually about." A few uncomfortable shifts. Someone coughed. "I'm not here because my father asked me to be. I'm here because I have things to say that need witnessing by people who matter in the circles my husband, my soon-to-be ex-husband, moves in." She walked to the windows where Isaiah had stood moments before, looking down at the city that spread out like a circuit board of ambition and consequence. 7 years ago, Grayson told me he loved me for who I was, not what I represented. He said pedigree didn't matter, only character. He promised we'd build something real together, something that transcended his mother's obsession with bloodlines and social registers. Nyla turned to face the room, and her expression held the kind of calm that comes after tears have been exhausted and only clarity remains. I believed him. Even when his mother made comments about my background, my skin, my education from a school that accepted scholarship students instead of legacy admits. Even when he stopped defending me at family dinners. Even when he started coming home late, smelling like perfume I didn't own. Grayson flinched but didn't speak. I believed him because I was carrying his child, and I wanted that child to grow up with parents who loved each other, who chose each other despite external pressure, who proved that love matters more than conforming to someone else's definition of acceptable. She moved closer to the table, and several board members leaned back slightly as if her presence carried physical force. "Last night, your chairman's mother poured wine over my head in front of 60 witnesses. She called my unborn baby mixed blood that would never be worthy of the Whitmore name. She physically removed me from a house I'd lived in for 3 years. And 60 people sat silent while it happened. Silence so absolute that traffic noise from 47 stories down became audible. Grayson sat silent while it happened. Her voice didn't break, but something in it made the words land heavier than shouting ever could. So I called my father, the man you all assumed was just a gardener who happened to raise a daughter clever enough to marry up. And he came, because that's what fathers do when their children are threatened. They protect them." Isaiah stood and moved beside her, a united front that shifted the power balance so dramatically that several board members exchanged glances, already calculating how to align themselves with whoever emerged victorious from this confrontation. "Here's what happens next," Nyla continued. "Griffin Global withdraws from the merger. Your stock price collapses. Your company faces bankruptcy within the quarter unless you secure alternative financing, which you won't, because every major institution will have heard why Griffin pulled out." She met Grayson's eyes directly for the first time since entering. "But I'm not vindictive. I'm just done pretending that making myself smaller would eventually make you love me enough to defend me." The baby kicked hard enough that she gasped slightly, one hand pressing to her ribs. The vulnerability of the gesture, pregnant woman steadying herself against the reality of impending single motherhood, created a moment of such raw humanity that even Victoria looked away. "I'm filing for divorce, uncontested, simple, final. You get nothing from the marriage because you never contributed anything. Every asset you thought you'd accumulated came from my father's generosity." "That's not possible," Grayson managed, his voice hoarse. "The house in Gramercy, the cars, the investment account, all held in trusts established when I turned 18, Nyla confirmed. "My father's lawyers handled the paperwork. You lived in my house, drove my cars, spent investment returns from my accounts. You just didn't know it because the documentation was structured to protect me in exactly this scenario." Sterling produced more papers, sliding them across polished wood. Property deeds, vehicle titles, account statements, all in Nyla Hartwell's name or in trust for her benefit. Mr. Whitmore's name appears nowhere in the ownership chain. Grayson picked up the papers like they might burn him. scanning lines that dismantled his entire understanding of his own success. His face progressed through emotions too quickly to catalog. Shock giving way to horror, giving way to a desperate attempt at anger that collapsed into something approaching comprehension of how thoroughly he'd been played. How many? The words barely qualified as a whisper. How many things did you control? All of them, Isaiah confirmed. Your promotion to CEO, your successful projects, your bonuses, your professional reputation, every single element of the life you thought you built yourself originated from my strategic planning. He pulled another document from Sterling's seemingly endless briefcase. Even the deal you thought you'd closed independently last month, retrofitting the Cordell building in Philadelphia. The client was Cordell Properties, which is owned by Cordell Holdings, which is a subsidiary of Griffin Development, which I own. I instructed them to hire Whitmore Industries and to overpay by 15% to make you look good in front of your board. Grayson's hands moved to his face, fingers pressing against his eyes, like he could somehow unsee the truth being laid bare. When he spoke again, his voice carried the hollow quality of someone who'd just realized they'd never actually existed. Why? If you hated me, if you thought I wasn't good enough for her, why not just tell Nyla? Why this elaborate, because I didn't hate you? Isaiah's expression softened slightly, though the steel underneath remained visible. I hoped you'd surprise me, hoped that when success came easy, you'd remember it was Nyla you wanted, not the life her money could buy. Hoped you'd be the man who wrote coffee shop notes instead of the man who let his mother throw wine on his pregnant wife. The words hit like physical blows. Grayson slumped in his chair, and for the first time since Nyla had known him, he looked small, not humbled, demolished. What about visitation? The question came from Victoria, her voice regaining some of its usual authority as she pivoted to damage control. Regardless of how we feel about each other, that baby is still a Whitmore. Grayson has rights. He has whatever rights Nyla chooses to grant, Isaiah interrupted. And before you threaten legal action, let me remind you that Connecticut family courts take very seriously cases involving assault of pregnant women. We have 4 witness statements already. Would you like us to get all 60? Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. I'm not here for revenge. Nyla's voice cut through the tension. I'm here for clarity. You all need to understand that I'm not the problem in this equation. I was never the problem. I was convenient to dismiss because I didn't come from the right families or attend the right schools or have skin that let you forget I existed. She turned to the board members who'd applauded Grayson's promotions and sat silent during Victoria's cruelties. But I'm also not a victim you get to pity as penance for your silence. I'm the daughter of the man who controls your company's future, and I'm choosing to be merciful in ways you didn't choose when it cost you nothing to speak up. Sterling cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, you have 7 days to vacate the Gramercy property. All furnishings purchased during your marriage remain as they belong to Mrs. Whitmore. Personal items only. You're kicking me out? Grayson looked between Nyla and Isaiah like they were speaking a language he didn't understand. No, Nyla corrected. I'm reclaiming my home. You're welcome to find new housing anywhere you can afford with your actual income. The distinction mattered. She wasn't destroying him, just removing the scaffolding that had held up his inflated self-image. Your position here at Whitmore Industries. Nyla paused, and several board members leaned forward despite themselves. You can keep it if you want, as Vice President of Operations, salary $180,000 annually, or you can resign. Either way, you're no longer CEO. The demotion landed with the weight of public humiliation. From CEO to VP, from corner office to middle management, from somebody to exactly who he'd been before Isaiah's money made him feel important. Who? Grayson couldn't finish the question. The board will appoint an interim CEO while we restructure, Sterling explained. Griffin Global will maintain ownership but bring in professional management with experience turning around struggling companies. Translation. People who understood their positions were contingent on competence, not family connections. Victoria finally found her full voice, the one she used when issuing ultimatums to caterers and bullying charity board members into compliance. This is unconscionable. You can't simply destroy a family because you don't approve of how they handled a domestic situation. I watched you pour wine over my pregnant daughter's head. Isaiah's words came quiet, which made them more terrifying than shouting would have been. I watched you call her baby mixed blood that didn't deserve your family name. I watched you orchestrate her humiliation in front of witnesses you thought would never matter. He stood, and despite wearing work clothes in a room full of designer suits, he dominated the space completely. You're right that I can't destroy your family, but I can remove every support structure I built that made you think you were untouchable. I can let you discover what life looks like when you're judged by the same standards you used to judge others. I can walk away and let consequences do what consequences do to people who confuse cruelty with class. The door opened again, and Mira Bennett entered carrying a leather portfolio that matched Sterling's. She was younger than the other lawyers, maybe 33, with the kind of intense focus that came from having fought for every opportunity she'd received. Mrs. Whitmore, Victoria Whitmore, that is, I have something you'll want to see. She placed a stack of printed emails on the table in front of Victoria, who stared at them like they might bite. These are communications between you and Serena Blackwood dating back 14 months. You introduced Ms. Blackwood to your son, you encouraged their professional relationship, and you specifically discussed how to position her as a better alternative to Nyla. Mira's finger traced highlighted text on the top page, and her voice took on the clipped precision of someone reading evidence into record. March 15th last year. Quote, Grayson needs an upgrade. Your background and connections are exactly what the Whitmore family requires. Let's arrange dinner. April 3rd. The coffee shop girl is pregnant. This complicates things but doesn't change the fundamental problem. November 28th. Christmas dinner will provide the perfect opportunity. I'll handle the scene. You position yourself as the dignified alternative. Victoria's face had gone from white to gray to a shade that suggested her blood pressure had reached dangerous levels. You orchestrated the affair, Nyla said, and her voice held wonder at the sheer calculation required. You didn't just tolerate Grayson cheating, you engineered it. I was protecting my family's legacy. You were protecting your ego. Isaiah's interruption carried the weight of final judgment. You couldn't stand that your son chose someone you considered beneath you, so you spent over a year systematically destroying their marriage. He turned to Serena, who'd been sitting frozen since Mira's entrance, her earlier calculation replaced by the dawning awareness that she'd been used as thoroughly as Grayson had. Ms. Blackwood, did you love my son-in-law? Serena's laugh came brittle. Love? No. I saw an opportunity. Rising executive, good family name, mother who clearly wanted him with someone like me instead of... She stopped, perhaps recognizing that finishing that sentence would only make everything worse. Instead of his wife, Nyla finished for her. The one who was carrying his child while you positioned yourself to replace her. I'm sorry. The words emerged automatic. The kind of apology that cost nothing because everyone knew it changed nothing. You should have been honest about what you wanted instead of pretending you cared about Grayson as anything except a stepping stone. Nyla's voice held no anger, which somehow made the observation land harder. But you made a calculation based on false information. Victoria promised you access to Whitmore money and status, neither of which exist without my father's support. Serena's eyes widened as the full scope of her miscalculation became clear. She'd positioned herself as the upgrade replacement for a woman she'd assumed was nobody important. Instead, she'd backed herself into a corner opposite the daughter of a trillionaire. The career mathematics weren't complicated. Every major corporation would hear about this within hours. The woman who'd helped break up Isaiah Hartwell's daughter's marriage wouldn't be hireable anywhere that mattered. I resign, Serena said quietly, effective immediately. Nobody argued. Sterling made a note, and the meeting continued like she'd already vanished. Mira produced another document, this one stapled and official-looking with law firm letterhead. Mr. Whitmore, this is a prenuptial agreement dated October 12th of last year, between you and Ms. Blackwood, promising her 40% of your assets upon divorce from Nyla. The room went silent again, a different quality of silence than before. This one held shock from people who thought they'd seen the full scope of the betrayal. Grayson grabbed the papers, scanning them with eyes that didn't want to comprehend what they were reading. I didn't sign this. Your signature appears on page 7, Mira noted. Notarized by Amanda Chen, who works for the law firm your mother uses for estate planning. I don't remember signing. Grayson stopped, memory clearly surfacing. Mom said it was paperwork for the Philadelphia deal. Said her lawyers needed my signature for insurance purposes. He looked at Victoria with something approaching betrayal, which would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. She'd orchestrated his entire affair, used him as a pawn in her vendetta against Nyla, and he was only now realizing his mother had viewed him as a tool instead of a son. You forged my signature on a prenup with my mistress. The words came out flat, like he was still processing. While my wife was pregnant, I was protecting you from a mistake. You were protecting your social standing. Nyla's voice cut through Victoria's excuse. You couldn't stand your friends knowing your son married the scholarship student who served them coffee, so you decided to replace me with someone whose father's name you recognized from political fundraisers. She moved closer to Victoria, close enough that she could see the expensive concealer failing to hide exhaustion lines. Here's what I want you to understand. I'm not angry. I'm not heartbroken. I'm not going to spend years being bitter about how you treated me. Nyla's hand rested on her belly, protective and certain. Because you gave me something valuable. You showed me exactly who you are when you think nobody's watching who matters. You proved that your son will always choose your approval over his own family. And you demonstrated that the legacy you're so desperate to protect is worthless because it's built on believing some people simply matter more than others. She turned to address the full board. I'm not destroying Whitmore Industries. I'm just removing the subsidy my father provided. If this company is as strong as Grayson claims, it'll survive on actual merit. If it collapses, that proves it never deserved to exist. The merger withdrawal becomes public in... Sterling checked his watch. 12 minutes. I suggest you prepare statements for investors, employees, and the press. This will be significant news. The board members stood, moving with the urgent purpose of people who needed to protect their own interests before everything caught fire. They filed out without looking at Grayson or Victoria, already calculating how to distance themselves from the collapse. Within 90 seconds, only family remained. Isaiah and Nyla on one side of the table, Grayson and Victoria on the other. Serena had slipped out during the exodus, her expensive heels clicking down the hallway toward elevators that would carry her out of their lives permanently. Grayson finally met Nyla's eyes directly, and what she saw there almost resembled the man she'd married. Almost, but not quite. The real version wouldn't have let it get this far. I'm sorry. He meant it, she could tell, but meaning it 7 years too late didn't change anything. I know, but sorry doesn't give me back the years I spent making myself smaller, hoping you'd notice. Sorry doesn't erase your mother throwing wine on me while I was pregnant. And sorry definitely doesn't mean I trust you anywhere near our child without supervision. Our child, Grayson's voice broke. I'm still the father. Biologically, yes, but fathers show up. Fathers defend their families. Fathers don't sit silent while their mothers call their babies mixed blood, unworthy of a name. Nyla gathered her coat, the one Emily had brought last night, still smelling faintly of snow. You can visit, supervised, scheduled, documented, because my daughter deserves to know who her father is, even if he's not who I hoped he'd be. But you don't get to pretend you're a parent when you wouldn't even defend her existence. Daughter? The word emerged tentative, like he was afraid to hope. Yes, I found out last week. Wanted to tell you at Christmas dinner before... She didn't finish. Before his mother destroyed everything, before she'd realized the marriage had been dead long before last night's cruelty made it official. Isaiah placed a hand on Nyla's shoulder, gentle and grounding. We should go. You have a doctor's appointment at noon and I promised to drive you. They walked towards the door, leaving Grayson and Victoria sitting in the boardroom that would no longer be theirs by evening. At the threshold, Nyla paused and looked back. I hope someday you understand what you lost. Not the money or the company or the social standing. Those are replaceable. But the chance to be part of something real, that's gone. And you can't buy it back no matter how much money you think you have. The door closed on Victoria's face, twisted with rage, and Grayson's collapsed in recognition of consequences. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless forward motion, indifferent to the personal devastation happening on the 47th floor. Isaiah and Nyla rode the elevator down in silence, emerging into a lobby where people rushed past carrying briefcases and ambitions, none of them knowing they'd just witnessed an empire's foundation crack. Isaiah's car waited at the curb, not one of the Rolls-Royces from last night, but his regular truck, the 1998 Ford F-150 with gardening equipment in the bed, and Connecticut plates that made valets at fancy restaurants exchange knowing looks about people who didn't belong. Nyla climbed in, and the familiar smell of soil and honest work made something in her chest loosen. This truck had driven her to school every day growing up, had taught her to drive on back roads where mistakes didn't cost anything except pride, had carried her to Columbia on move-in day, her father refusing the offer of hired movers because he wanted those last few hours together. You did well in there, Isaiah said as they merged into traffic. Your mother would have been proud. The mention of Lorraine made Nyla reach for her purse, where the sealed envelope had lived since her mother's death. 8 years of wondering what wisdom could only be opened when everything was taken. She broke the seal now in her father's truck, while pregnant and divorced and somehow stronger than she'd ever been. Her mother's handwriting filled pages in careful script, the loops and crosses exactly as Nyla remembered from grocery lists and birthday cards and notes left in lunchboxes throughout childhood. My darling Nyla, if you're reading this, it means the worst happened. Someone you trusted hurt you badly enough that you have nothing left but yourself. I'm sorry I'm not there to hold you while you grieve. But I need you to understand something your father and I learned building a life together. Worth is not measured in bank accounts or skin color or who chooses to love you. Worth is measured in how you treat people who can do nothing for you, in whether you stay kind when the world gives you permission to be cruel, in choosing mercy when revenge would be easier. Your father came to America with $200 and dreams bigger than the people around him wanted to allow. He faced every kind of discrimination you can imagine. He was told he'd never amount to anything, that people like him should be grateful for whatever scraps they received. He built an empire anyway, not because he wanted to prove them wrong, but because he knew his own value regardless of what others chose to see. That's his gift to you. Not the money, though that's there if you need it. The real inheritance is knowing that other people's limitations don't define what you can become. I grew up poor in circumstances that don't need repeating. The one thing I learned is that people who have everything often value nothing. They think comfort is a birthright rather than a privilege. They confuse cruelty with class because they've never experienced consequences for either. If you married someone and they revealed themselves to be this kind of person, I'm sorry. But I'm also grateful you discovered it before wasting more years hoping they'd change. People rarely change unless pain forces them. And even then, they usually just get better at hiding who they really are. What matters now is what you build next. You have resources, use them wisely. You have strength, more than you know, trust it. And you have a daughter or son coming who needs to learn from your example that dignity matters more than comfort. Teach her what your father taught me. Patience is the most expensive thing to own. Poor people can't afford to wait. Rich people buy time but waste it. Only the wise understand that waiting for the right moment has more power than acting from anger. Live well, love carefully. Raise your child to know their worth isn't dependent on others' approval. I'm so proud of who you've become. Mom. Nyla read the letter twice, tears blurring the words the second time through. Her mother had known. Somehow, years before Grayson's betrayal, Lorraine had known that wealth attracted parasites and that her daughter would need permission to walk away when love turned toxic. She always was smarter than me, Isaiah said quietly, having read enough of the letter over Nyla's shoulder to understand its contents. She chose you. That was pretty smart. He smiled, rare and genuine. Smartest thing she ever did, tolerating an arrogant immigrant who thought he could buy the world. Did you? Buy the world? Most of it, still working on Antarctica. The joke broke the tension, and Nyla laughed despite everything. Her father had that gift, making impossible situations feel survivable through sheer refusal to let circumstances define him. They drove through Manhattan traffic, heading toward Brooklyn Methodist, where Nyla's obstetrician maintained a practice that treated everyone the same, regardless of whether they arrived in Bentleys or on the subway. The city flowed past, millions of people building lives and breaking promises and trying desperately to matter in a world that forgot most of them before they died. Somewhere in that crowd, Grayson was realizing his entire identity had been purchased. Victoria was calculating damage control. Serena was updating her resume and hoping her last name carried enough weight to survive this scandal. And Nyla was free of all of them, carrying a daughter who would grow up knowing her worth wasn't up for negotiation. The truck's radio played something classical, and outside the windows the first snow of a new storm began to fall. 6 weeks after the boardroom confrontation, Nyla stood in a brownstone apartment in Park Slope that smelled like fresh paint and possibilities. 3 bedrooms, exposed brick, windows that faced a tree-lined street where children played and neighbors knew each other's names. The rent cost $4,200 monthly. Expensive by most standards, laughably cheap considering she could have bought the entire building with a fraction of her trust fund. But buying felt like proving something. Renting felt like choosing. Isaiah carried boxes up the stairs despite her protests. His 64 years apparently no match for stubbornness inherited from both parents. He'd insisted on helping with the move, showing up at dawn with his truck and that quiet determination that had built empires while other people were still deciding whether immigrants deserved opportunities. "Last one," he announced, setting a box labeled kitchen on the counter. "You sure you don't want the penthouse in Tribeca, the one with the view?" "I'm sure. This feels right." And it did. The brownstone sat on a block where people hung laundry from fire escapes and bodega owners knew customers by first names, where wealth didn't announce itself in doormen and marble lobbies, but in the quiet luxury of time spent watching trees grow. The baby kicked, and Nyla pressed her palm to the spot where a tiny foot pushed back. 7.5 months now, her daughter growing stronger while the world that had tried to diminish both of them grew distant as a bad dream half forgotten. Across town in Queens, Grayson Whitmore sat in his mother's 2-bedroom apartment staring at a laptop that displayed his dwindling bank balance. The severance package from Whitmore Industries, the company that no longer bore his family name after Griffin Global installed new management, had seemed generous at first. 3 months' salary, continuation of health insurance, a reference letter that praised his years of service while carefully avoiding mention of actual accomplishments. Then came the bills, legal fees for the divorce he hadn't contested because fighting would have required evidence of contributions to a marriage he'd only parasitized. Rent on a studio in Long Island City because everywhere closer cost more than his new salary as a consultant for a firm that had hired him more from pity than need. Credit card debt accumulated during years when he'd assumed his income would only increase, not evaporate. He'd applied to 14 companies in the past month. 2 had granted interviews. Both ended when interviewers Googled his name and found articles about Isaiah Hartwell's daughter and the CEO who'd failed so spectacularly that a trillionaire had publicly dismantled his career. Victoria moved through the apartment with the brittle energy of someone who'd spent her entire life building a persona that no longer fit the circumstances. The country club had not renewed her membership. A polite letter citing budget restructuring that everyone knew meant social exile. Her name had disappeared from charity board listings. Invitations to galas and fundraisers stopped arriving as if she'd been erased from databases that tracked who mattered in Greenwich social circles. She tried attending her regular Episcopal church the Sunday after the boardroom confrontation, sat in her usual pew while conversations died when she approached and resumed when she passed. The temperature hadn't physically changed, but everyone felt it. That particular chill reserved for people who'd crossed lines that polite society wouldn't name but would absolutely enforce. The following week, she'd tried a different church across town, then another, finally settling on a Catholic parish in Stamford where nobody knew her history, and the priest seemed more interested in salvation than social standing. Being tolerated felt worse than being hated. Hatred at least acknowledged you mattered enough to provoke strong emotion. Tolerance just meant you'd become background noise in rooms where you'd once commanded attention. "I had lunch with Patricia Caldwell yesterday," Victoria mentioned, slicing vegetables with more force than required. "She pretended not to see me in the restaurant. We've been friends for 32 years. Grayson looked up from his laptop, and the expression on his face held something Victoria had spent his entire childhood trying to prevent. Pity for his mother. "Maybe she really didn't see you. She saw me. She just decided I wasn't worth acknowledging anymore." The knife came down hard enough to crack the cutting board. Victoria stared at the damaged wood like it had personally betrayed her, then set the knife aside with shaking hands. "This is your fault," she whispered, though the words carried no real conviction. "If you'd just married Jennifer Peterson like I suggested." "Mom!" Grayson's interruption emerged gentle, which somehow made it more devastating than anger would have been. "I made my own choices. You made yours. We're both living with consequences." Victoria's face crumpled, tears starting and stopping like she'd forgotten how to let them flow after decades of treating emotion as weakness to be controlled. Across the river in Manhattan, Serena Blackwood packed the last of her apartment into boxes labeled for storage. The job offer from a tech startup in Austin had come with a title inflation, Senior VP of Marketing instead of just VP, and a salary that almost matched what she'd earned at Whitmore. Almost, but not quite. The real cost showed in the phone calls that didn't come, references that former colleagues declined to provide, networking contacts who suddenly had full calendars and couldn't meet for coffee to discuss opportunities. Her name had become associated with the Isaiah Hartwell scandal, and people with real power had long memories about who'd participated in hurting someone that powerful's daughter. Didn't matter that she'd been manipulated by Victoria, that she'd believed the Whitmores actually had the wealth and influence they projected. Didn't matter that she'd apologized, resigned, tried to make amends through channels that went nowhere. What mattered was that she'd positioned herself opposite Nyla Hartwell, and in the arithmetic of consequence, that equation never balanced in her favor. Austin represented escape more than opportunity. A chance to rebuild in a city where nobody knew her history and tech money moved too fast to care about East Coast social scandals. She'd miss New York, the energy, the connections, the feeling of being at the center of things that mattered. But staying meant drowning slowly in a reputation that preceded every introduction and poisoned every opportunity. The movers arrived at noon, efficient and impersonal, carrying her life into a truck headed southwest toward reinvention or obscurity. Probably both. In Park Slope, Nyla's obstetrician confirmed what her body had been insisting for the past week. The baby had dropped, positioning herself for an arrival that might come early. "Any day now," Dr. Rachel Martinez said, her hands gentle on Nyla's belly. "Could be tonight, could be 3 weeks, but this little one seems ready to meet the world." Nyla lay back on the examination table, staring at ceiling tiles while her daughter's heartbeat filled the room through the Doppler's speaker. Strong and steady, that sound, the rhythm of a new life completely ignorant of the drama that had preceded her existence. "Have you thought about who you want in the delivery room?" Dr. Martinez washed her hands with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned medicine in an era when infections killed. "Partner, family, doula. My father and my friend Mira." Not Grayson, though he'd asked. Sent an email 3 weeks ago, formal and awkward, like he was writing to a colleague instead of the mother of his child. Requesting permission to be present for the birth, promising he'd stay quiet, just wanting to witness his daughter entering the world. Nyla had declined with equal formality. Childbirth required vulnerability. She wasn't willing to share with someone who'd proven his presence. Came with conditions and withdrawal clauses. She'd need support, not obligation masquerading as interest. The baby kicked hard against the Doppler, and Dr. Martinez smiled. "Spirited one. She'll keep you busy." "Good. I don't do well with boredom." The appointment ended with instructions to come in immediately if contractions started at regular intervals, or her water broke, or she experienced any of the dozen warning signs that separated normal labor from medical emergency. Nyla dressed slowly, her body awkward with the weight she carried, and emerged into afternoon light that felt too bright for March. Isaiah waited in the lobby, reading a gardening magazine with the focused attention he brought to everything. He looked up when she approached, and the question in his eyes asked what words didn't need to. "Any day now." His smile broke across his face like sunrise, rare and transformative. "Your mother would be over the moon. She'd probably have opinions about my birth plan. You know how she got about medical stuff. She'd have opinions about everything and still support whatever you decided. That was her gift, knowing when to advise and when to just hold your hand." They walked to his truck, still the F-150, still carrying gardening equipment despite owning enough wealth to commission custom vehicles that cost more than most houses. Some things didn't need changing just because circumstances allowed it. The drive back to Park Slope took them through neighborhoods transitioning from winter to spring, trees budding despite calendar dates that suggested patience. New York didn't wait for official seasons. It moved on its own schedule, indifferent to tradition or expectation. "I got a letter from Emily," Nyla mentioned, watching buildings scroll past. "Grayson's sister." Isaiah's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. What did she want? To apologize again? To ask if she could visit after the baby's born? To tell me she's been going to therapy to figure out why she stayed silent when staying silent made her complicit? "You going to let her visit?" Nyla considered while traffic lights cycled and pedestrians crossed against signals with the particular confidence of New Yorkers who'd calculated risk against inconvenience and decided jaywalking won. Maybe. She's the only one who actually seemed to understand what she'd done wrong. Victoria still thinks the problem was execution rather than intent. Grayson thinks apologizing absolves him without requiring actual change. But Emily, she's trying to become someone different instead of just managing the public relations of who she already is. That's generous of you. Or strategic. My daughter deserves to know her aunt if her aunt can be trusted. Cutting off everyone connected to Grayson just punishes the baby for adult failures. Isaiah nodded slowly, the gesture carrying approval without needing elaboration. He pulled up outside the brownstone where Mira Bennett sat on the stoop holding 2 cups from the coffee shop 3 blocks over that made cappuccinos almost as good as Nyla remembered from her barista days. "Decaf," Mira announced, handing one to Nyla. "Because I'm a good friend who read all the pregnancy books despite having zero personal interest in ever being pregnant myself. You're a saint. I'm a lawyer who bills $400 an hour and considers friendship a strategic investment in future godparent privileges." They sat on the stoop while Isaiah carried more boxes upstairs, the March air still holding winter's edge but promising warmth that would arrive eventually. Around them, the neighborhood moved through its afternoon rhythms. Kids home from school, parents returning from work, the bodega owner sweeping sidewalks with the meditative focus of ritual practice daily. "Grayson's been calling the office," Mira mentioned casually, "asking if you'd reconsider letting him be at the birth. You told him no?" "I told him you'd made your decision clear and repeating the question wasn't going to change the answer." Also implied that continued harassment might affect his visitation privileges, which isn't strictly true but seemed motivational. Nyla sipped her decaf, letting warmth spread through her chest. "Has he been asking about visitation schedules?" "Every 3 days like clockwork. Wants to know exact times, whether he can have overnight stays, if he'll be allowed to introduce her to his family." His family being Victoria, presumably. Though from what I hear, Victoria's been lying low, living with him in Queens, which is apparently going about as well as you'd expect for a woman who spent her entire life believing Queens was where the help lived. The image of Victoria Whitmore in a 2-bedroom apartment sharing space with her failures made something twist in Nyla's chest. Not quite satisfaction. She'd meant what she told the board about not wanting revenge, but acknowledgement that consequences had arrived for people who'd believed themselves immune felt like justice operating the way it should. "You think I'm being too harsh?" The question emerged before Nyla could stop it. "About the delivery room?" Mira turned to face her, fully lawyer mode dropping away to reveal the friend underneath. "I think you're protecting yourself and your baby during a moment of extreme vulnerability. I think you have zero obligation to perform forgiveness for people who hurt you just because they've started feeling bad about it. And I think letting Grayson participate in your daughter's birth after he sat silent while his mother called her mixed blood would be emotional violence you don't deserve." The words landed with the force of permission Nyla hadn't realized she needed. She'd spent so much energy over the past 6 weeks wondering if mercy required suffering, if being the bigger person meant accepting pain to prove her nobility. But mercy didn't require self-harm. Being dignified didn't mean volunteering to be diminished. "Thank you." "For what? Being honest? That's baseline friendship. For reminding me that I'm allowed to have boundaries even when maintaining them disappoints people." Mira's smile carried warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "Anytime. That's literally why you're paying me $400 an hour. I thought you were doing this as a friend." "Friendship and fair compensation aren't mutually exclusive. Your father taught me that when he hired me straight out of Columbia Law, despite my zero experience with corporate work. Paid me market rate because he said anything less would be charity masquerading as opportunity." Nyla filed that detail away with all the other evidence of her father's philosophy. Respect came in fair wages and clear expectations, not in patronizing generosity that kept recipients perpetually grateful. Isaiah emerged from the building, brushing dust from his work shirt. "All set. Furniture's arranged, kitchen stocked, nurseries ready for whenever this little one decides to make her appearance." The nursery. Nyla had spent 2 weeks choosing paint colors, settling on soft gray that could grow with her daughter instead of pink that assumed preferences before personality developed. Isaiah had assembled the crib with the particular care he brought to building anything meant to last. The walls held no Disney characters or generic decorations, just 3 framed photographs. Lorraine Hartwell at 20, radiant and fierce. Isaiah and Lorraine on their wedding day, young and certain. and a space left empty for the baby's first portrait. "Want to see?" Isaiah offered, and Mira stood, brushing cookie crumbs from her suit. They climbed stairs that creaked in comfortable ways, the brownstone's age showing in details that modern buildings engineered out. The nursery occupied the smallest bedroom, which felt right. Babies didn't need square footage. They needed presence and attention and security that had nothing to do with size. Afternoon light filtered through curtains Nyla had chosen specifically because they weren't blackout. She wanted her daughter to wake with the sun, to understand natural rhythms instead of artificial control over when day began and ended. The empty frame on the wall drew her attention. In a few weeks, maybe days, that space would hold an image of the person she'd been carrying for 9 months. A face she'd imagined but never seen. Features that might favor her or Grayson or some combination that created entirely new beauty. "You're going to be an amazing mother," Mira observed, her tone carrying the certainty of someone who'd watched Nyla navigate impossible situations with grace that never required cruelty. "I hope so. I'm terrified I'll mess it up." "Everyone's terrified," Isaiah said quietly. "Your mother and I were absolutely convinced we'd break you somehow. Turns out babies are more resilient than parents' anxiety." "Did you ever wish—" Nyla stopped, unsure how to phrase the question that had haunted her since the boardroom. "Did you ever wish you'd told me about the money earlier, before I married Grayson?" Isaiah considered while traffic noise drifted through open windows and the city continued its relentless forward motion outside. "Every day since your mother died, but telling you would have changed who you became. You'd have questioned whether people liked you for yourself or your trust fund. You'd have second-guessed every relationship, every friendship, wondering about ulterior motives." He moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back in that particular stance he adopted when working through complex thoughts. "I wanted you to know you were enough exactly as you were. That people could love you without knowing about the money, that your worth existed independent of wealth." "But Grayson didn't love me independent of wealth. He just didn't know where the wealth was." "Exactly. And now you know that for certain instead of always wondering. That clarity cost you pain, and I'm sorry for that. But it saved you from spending 50 years with someone who'd have grown to resent you every time you didn't make yourself small enough for his comfort." The baby kicked hard enough that Nyla gasped, and both Isaiah and Mira moved reflexively toward her before she waved them off. "She's just active, probably running out of space in there. Getting ready to meet her grandfather," Isaiah said, with the particular kind of hope that came from second chances and new beginnings. 3 days later, at 2 in the morning, while March rain hammered against windows, Nyla's water broke with the cinematic drama she'd hoped to avoid. One moment she was sleeping, the next she was standing in a puddle wondering if this was actually happening or if pregnancy had invented new ways to humiliate her even while sleeping. The contractions started 20 minutes later. Irregular at first, then settling into a rhythm that suggested her daughter had inherited her father's punctuality if nothing else useful. Isaiah drove through empty streets with the particular focus of someone who'd been waiting for this call. Mira met them at Brooklyn Methodist, somehow looking professional despite the hour, carrying the hospital bag Nyla had packed 3 weeks ago when nesting instinct had overcome rational thought. Dr. Martinez arrived an hour into labor, examined Nyla with efficient gentleness, and delivered the news that first-time mothers both wanted and dreaded. "You're at 4 centimeters. This is going to take a while." A while turned into 8 hours of contractions that made Nyla reconsider every life choice that had led to this moment. Isaiah held her hand through the worst of it, his presence steady as bedrock while she squeezed hard enough to cut circulation. Mira handled logistics, updating family, fielding phone calls, managing the hospital staff, who seemed to think everyone needed constant monitoring even when everything was progressing normally. At 10:47 a.m., after pushing that made every muscle in her body scream protest, Nyla heard the sound she'd been waiting 9 months to hear. Her daughter's first cry. Strong and angry, that sound. Indignant at being evicted from comfortable darkness into harsh light and cold air. Dr. Martinez placed the baby on Nyla's chest, and the crying stopped as if some fundamental recognition had occurred. Tiny fists curled against Nyla's skin, eyes that couldn't quite focus yet searched for the face that matched the heartbeat she'd known since consciousness began. A small mouth opened and closed, testing air that tasted different than amniotic fluid. "She's perfect," Isaiah whispered, tears streaming down his face without shame or attempt to hide them. And she was. 7 pounds, 3 ounces of perfect, with hair darker than Nyla's and features that would shift and settle over months into their final configuration. She had Grayson's nose, small and straight, and Nyla's mouth. Her skin held that particular shade that made categorization irrelevant and beauty undeniable. "Name?" Dr. Martinez prompted gently while nurses performed checks and measurements that disrupted the moment but served purposes Nyla understood intellectually, even while resenting them emotionally. "Lorraine Hartwell." Isaiah made a sound somewhere between laugh and sob, and Mira wiped her own eyes with the back of her hand. Despite having sworn she wouldn't get emotional, because emotions were for people who hadn't spent law school learning to compartmentalize. The nurses returned Lorraine after their assessment, and Nyla held her daughter properly for the first time. The weight felt both substantial and fragile, like holding something infinitely precious that could break if not supported exactly right. "Hello, baby girl," she whispered. "I'm your mom. That terrifying crying man is your grandfather. And the woman pretending she's not crying is your Aunt Mira, who's going to spoil you rotten and teach you how to argue effectively." Lorraine made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a test of vocal capabilities, and settled against Nyla's chest with the particular contentment of someone who'd found exactly where they belonged. The hospital room settled into quiet, broken only by monitoring equipment and the ambient noise of a maternity ward where new lives arrived hourly. Isaiah pulled up a chair, his gardener's hands gentle on Lorraine's tiny head. Mira stood at the window, giving them space while remaining present, the particular gift of people who understood when to be involved and when to simply witness. Nyla's phone buzzed with a text. "Grayson, somehow having found out despite not being on the notification list. I heard. Congratulations. Is she healthy?" The message carried all his usual awkwardness around emotion, that tendency to treat feelings like business communications requiring formal language and careful distance. Nyla typed back one-handed while Lorraine nursed with the determined focus of someone approaching a task for the first time but absolutely certain of the objective. "She's perfect. Her name is Lorraine." The response came immediately. "After your mother. That's beautiful. Can I visit?" Nyla looked at her daughter, this tiny person who'd existed for less than an hour, but had already reorganized every priority and redefined every boundary. Lorraine deserved to know her father even if her father had proven himself disappointing. But that knowledge could wait until Nyla had recovered enough to navigate the complexity of supervised visitation and emotional management. "In a few days. I'll let you know when." She put the phone away before he could respond, before the conversation could evolve into negotiation about timing and access and all the logistical details that would define their co-parenting relationship. Right now, this moment belonged to her and her daughter, and the people who'd actually shown up when showing up mattered. 2 weeks after Lorraine's birth, Nyla sat on the brownstone's front stoop while her daughter slept in the carrier against her chest. March had given way to April, and the trees that lined the street were budding with that particular optimism that came before reality delivered frost and disappointment. Elijah Cross walked up the block carrying a paper bag from the bodega, and recognition took a moment to surface. The FedEx driver who'd given her his jacket that Christmas night, who'd called her father and waited with her while snow fell and her old life ended. He stopped when he saw her, surprise crossing features that looked tired in ways delivery driving didn't fully explain. "You're okay," relief colored the words. "I wondered. After that night, I wasn't sure if you'd be okay." "I'm more than okay. I'm—" Nyla gestured at the brownstone, the baby, the life she'd built in the weeks since devastation. "I'm good." Elijah's smile reached his eyes, genuine warmth that asked nothing in return. "That your daughter?" "Lorraine. 2 weeks old today." He moved closer, careful not to crowd, and looked at the sleeping baby with the particular tenderness of people who understood that new life deserved reverence regardless of circumstances. "She's beautiful. Congratulations." They stood in comfortable silence while the neighborhood moved around them. Kids playing, couples walking, the bodega owner arguing good-naturedly with the supplier about the price of coffee. "You live around here?" Nyla finally asked, because the coincidence of encountering him on her block suggested something beyond random chance. "3 streets over. Been in the same apartment for 6 years now. Rent control, terrible plumbing, but the neighbors are good people." "You're still driving for FedEx?" "Part-time. Also doing carpentry work when I can get it. Made a career change a few months back. Turns out driving packages doesn't fulfill the soul as much as building things with your hands." He held up his own hands, rough with calluses that suggested recent manual labor. "What are you building?" "Right now? Furniture for people who want handmade instead of IKEA. Long-term? Trying to start a nonprofit that teaches woodworking to kids in neighborhoods where shop class got cut from school budgets." The passion in his voice when he described the nonprofit carried the weight of purpose found rather than inherited. He talked about teaching 13-year-olds to measure twice and cut once, about the particular pride that came from building something functional from raw materials, about how working with wood gave kids something besides screens to focus their attention on. Nyla found herself listening with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with genuine interest. When he finished, she shifted Lorraine slightly and met his eyes directly. "That's remarkable work. The kind that actually changes lives instead of just making noise about change." "Thanks. Funding's been tricky, but I'm figuring it out." An idea formed, the kind that came from resources meeting need in ways that created value beyond simple charity. What if you had a donor, someone willing to seed the nonprofit properly in exchange for transparency about how the money gets used? Elijah's expression shifted through confusion to understanding to something approaching wariness. "I'm not looking for handouts." "Good, because I'm not offering one. I'm suggesting investment in something worthwhile. You build the program, report on outcomes, show actual impact. I provide capital and connections to people who might hire your students after they learn the skills." She kept her voice level, careful not to let the conversation become about her wealth or his pride. "I watched 60 people sit silent while I got humiliated. You stopped and offered your jacket without knowing anything except that someone needed help. That kind of character deserves support, not charity. There's a difference." Lorraine stirred against her chest, small movements that suggested waking. Elijah watched the baby with an expression that held too many emotions to categorize. Hope and grief and something that looked like recognition of second chances. "I have a daughter too," he said quietly. 8 years old. Lives with her mother in Queens. I see her Saturdays when my schedule allows, which isn't often enough, but it's what we negotiated in the custody agreement." The confession carried weight beyond simple fact-sharing. He was offering trust in exchange for the trust Nyla had extended by suggesting partnership instead of pity. "What's her name?" "Maya. She wants to be an astronaut or a veterinarian depending on which day you ask. Smart as hell and stubborn enough to actually accomplish whichever one she commits to." His smile when he talked about his daughter transformed his entire face. revealing depths of love that transcended circumstance and distance. She'd probably love learning woodworking. If you're interested in having an 8-year-old test case for your teaching methods, I'd love that. Though fair warning, 8-year-olds have zero patience for sanding. Neither do 32-year-olds. But we do it anyway because finishing work matters. They exchanged numbers with the understanding that the conversation would continue when both had time to think through logistics and expectations. Elijah headed toward his apartment, paper bag swinging, while Nyla carried Lorraine inside and settled into the nursing chair that had quickly become her favorite piece of furniture. The baby latched with increasing confidence, and Nyla used her free hand to open her mother's journal. The pages she'd read a dozen times since that day in Isaiah's truck, but kept returning to because some wisdom required repetition before it settled into bone-deep truth. Worth is measured in how you treat people who can do nothing for you. Lorraine couldn't do anything for anyone except exist and need and trust that the world would catch her when she fell. And somehow that basic vulnerability had reorganized Nyla's entire understanding of what mattered. Not revenge against people who'd hurt her, not proving herself to circles that would never accept her regardless of accomplishment. Not accumulating wealth or status or the hollow victories that came from being acknowledged by people whose judgment was worthless. What mattered was showing up for people who needed showing up for. Building things that outlasted ego. Teaching her daughter that kindness wasn't weakness and boundaries weren't cruelty, and that you could be both merciful and uncompromising about protecting what you loved. The afternoon settled into evening, and Isaiah arrived with takeout from the Thai place Nyla had introduced him to weeks ago when cooking felt impossible and nutrition felt optional. They ate on the floor because the dining table was covered in baby equipment, and Lorraine slept in her bassinet making the small sounds that newborns made while processing existence. "Ran into someone today?" Nyla mentioned between bites of pad thai. "The FedEx driver from Christmas." Isaiah paused mid-chew. "The one who gave you his jacket?" "Elijah Cross. Turns out he lives 3 blocks over. Quit delivery driving to do carpentry and start a nonprofit teaching woodworking to kids." "And I offered to fund it, if he's interested in having an investor instead of a donor." Her father's smile broke slow and genuine across his face. "Your mother would have done exactly the same thing. Found someone doing good work and figured out how to support it without making them feel small for needing support." They finished dinner while Lorraine slept and the city outside continued its endless motion. Later, after Isaiah left and the brownstone settled into nighttime quiet, Nyla carried her daughter to the window and looked out at streets where lives intersected and diverged in patterns too complex to predict. Somewhere in Queens, Grayson was probably sitting in his mother's apartment wondering how everything had collapsed so completely. Victoria was learning that social death felt worse than actual death because you had to keep living through the irrelevance. Serena was starting over in Austin, trying to build a reputation that wasn't poisoned by proximity to scandal. And here in Park Slope, Nyla held her daughter and understood that the best revenge was never revenge at all. It was building something beautiful from the wreckage and refusing to let other people's smallness define your capacity for grace. "Your grandmother wrote that patience is expensive," she whispered to Lorraine, who blinked up at her with eyes that would eventually settle into their permanent color, but for now held that indeterminate shade of newborn blue. She meant that people with nothing can't afford to wait, but people with everything can choose when to act, and when to let time do the work consequences need. Lorraine yawned, tiny mouth opening wide, and settled back against Nyla's chest with the particular contentment of someone who knew exactly where they belonged. Outside, the first real warmth of spring arrived on wind that carried the scent of growing things. Trees budded despite lingering cold, flowers pushed through soil that still remembered winter. And life continued its stubborn insistence on renewal regardless of how thoroughly last season had tried to destroy it. Nyla stood at that window holding her daughter while the city transformed from day to night, and she understood what her mother had tried to teach through journal pages written years before they'd be needed. That some people lose everything and learn from it, while others lose everything and stay exactly who they always were. She'd chosen learning, chosen growth, chosen to become someone her daughter could look at in 20 years and see strength that never required cruelty, boundaries that protected without punishing, and mercy that understood the difference between forgiveness and allowing people unlimited access to hurt you again. The brownstone creaked with the particular sounds old buildings made settling into themselves. Lorraine's breathing evened into the rhythm of deep sleep, and Nyla finally understood that she'd never been too small for Grayson's world. His world had simply been too small to contain everything she'd always been capable of becoming.